My sister is back for another sister episode. Rachel kicked off season 2 with me in episode 1 about burnout and emotional intelligence in the workplace, and is one of the most listened to podcast episodes this season. So today we are continuing the conversation with conflict management, because conflict is not always comfortable, but we can learn the skills that make us feel more confident during these inevitable interactions. So today we are going to get down and dirty about how conflict makes us feel and how we can approach these difficult conversations with more confidence, more ease, and with an open mind. And the best part? After we recorded this podcast, the two of us decided that it really needed to be something more than just a podcast episode. So as a result, we created the Confidence in Conflict course, which is specifically for school leaders and administrators. In this 4-part series, you will create more positive relationships to increase morale and develop a culture of trust within your school district by learning how to engage in these difficult conversations productively. You are definitely going to want to be a part of this incredible workshop, which begins on January 4th, but doors are now open for registration at empowerededucator.com/workshops. I cannot wait to see you there. Remember all the passion and vision you had when you first went into teaching? Feeling like building young minds and creating community through your work would make a lasting impact on this world? Well, those days may feel like they're behind you now because you're exhausted, stressed, and overwhelmed and frustrated, but I'm here to tell you it doesn't have to be like this. In fact, the love of teaching never really went away, but it absolutely needs transformation. Welcome to the Take Notes podcast. I'm Jen Rafferty, former music teacher, mom of 2, and certified emotional intelligence practitioner, and I'm here to light the way for you. In order to create a generational change for our kids, we need to shift the paradigm away from the perpetual stress and overwhelm and into a life of joy and fulfillment. This is Education 2.0, where you become the priority, shift how you live your life, and how you show up both at work and at home. So take a sip of steamy morning coffee and grab your notebook. It's time to take notes. Hello, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of Take Notes. And today's episode is another sister episode with my favorite sister and only sister, Rachel. Hi, Rachel.
Hey, so excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. For those of you who haven't listened to episode 1 of season 2, go ahead and make sure you check that one out. That was the beginning of our conversation, and we realized we had so much to talk about that Rachel was going to be a regular guest on Take Notes. So for those of you who haven't listened to it yet, Rachel is head of learning and development at Veterinary Growth Partners, and she's a content creator, a consultant, and speaker, and creates and delivers interactive leadership training programs that support veterinary practices in establishing or sustaining highly productive teams. So you might be thinking, well, veterinary practices, Jen, this is a podcast for educators. Well, I have to tell you that the work that Rachel does is incredibly parallel with the work that I do here at Empowered Educator, because no matter what the industry is, whether it's veterinary industry or education, leadership is leadership is leadership is leadership. And a lot of the same skills are directly related. Wouldn't you agree, Rach?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's every single time I present or we deliver content, somebody comes up to me and they're like, oh my God, I just realized like my partner could use this at their office. And oh, my mom works in this other industry. Like, can you do this for them? So absolutely. I mean, this is universal as far as usage in the workplace and also personally, of course.
Oh, absolutely personally. And what's been so wonderful is that the two of us have been doing this work in this way for so long that we've been collaborating kind of behind the scenes with everything that we've been doing. So it's really cool that we finally have this forum to talk about this together in person on this platform. So one of the things I really wanted to dive into, which is, I think, unique to your skill set and your training, is conflict management. So especially in a working environment that is service driven, a lot of times we try to avoid conflict. And what usually happens is that we create this toxic peace instead of having these really difficult conversations. So first, why don't you share a little bit of like, why did you even get into conflict management? Why was that something that was interesting to you in the first place?
Sure. Conflict was interesting to me because it scared me a lot. And this is an exercise that we often do when we start presenting this material to a group is sort of a word association. Like when I say the word conflict, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And often it's fear, anger, aggression, yelling, all of those kind of destructive sort of negative responses that you would expect most of the time when people think of a conflict. Avoidance is a big one. Like literally people will be like, I hear conflict, the word conflict, and I think run, avoid. So I was one of those people. I think like many of us are. I don't think most of us grow up feeling conflict positive or view it in any sort of such way. So to me, this was an opportunity because conflict is inevitable. Conflict comes in all shapes and sizes. And I was afraid of the very itty bitty conflicts. And I was equally as afraid and what I thought to be terrible at handling big conflicts. And there were a lot of reasons behind it. So conflict is a part of our everyday life. And so to me, learning more about it, understanding how I handle conflict and opportunities for my own personal growth was the first step in, I wanted to create a more positive relationship with conflict because I knew that I wasn't feeling confident in this area. I knew that it scared me to death and I knew that it was unavoidable. And so the first step that I took in developing a more positive relationship with conflict was learning about how I handle conflict, learning about what my triggers were, what were the constructive and destructive responses to it. So initially, this interest really came from a personal exploration as far as that certification goes and learning more than about how to help others and train others to be more comfortable in handling regular conflict at work.
Yeah. So I want to just highlight one thing because this is really important. We have to do the inner work first. Otherwise, it's shallow and it's not going to be as effective unless you really put up the mirror to yourself and start asking some really difficult questions. And this is a theme of whatever you want to grow and develop and learn. We have to start with ourselves. So I'm so glad, throughout your journey that you've shared so far with us, especially in that first episode of how you even got started in emotional intelligence, it really did start with your curiosity of self-discovery. So I just not only want to applaud you, but just highlight this as a theme of everything that we're doing. The change always has to start with you. And so why are people afraid of conflict? Let's start there. Because, you and I grew up in the same household. I could probably share some of the things that are triggers for you and the reasons why. We were brought up where our parents didn't like conflict either. So although we lived in what might have been on the surface a conflict-free household, there was a lot that wasn't said. And that created some level of discomfort that we were able to even feel as kids.
Yeah. There's definitely a whole spectrum of how people grow up, right? We definitely were on the far end of conflict avoidant. I work with somebody who grew up on the flip side. So a lot of the trainings that we do, I work alongside Sean McVeigh, who has been doing this work for a really long time in our industry as well. And it's just really interesting to hear his side too, because he grew up in the complete polar opposite. Conflict was loud. Conflict was angry. Conflict was physical, right? Conflict could be violent. And that was not my experience at all. And what I find most interesting, the more we dig into conflict, is that, yes, the way that we were raised definitely defines the beliefs that we have around conflict and the comfort level we have along with the skill set that we have or lack. And that is just sort of the tools that we're given, whether we like it or not, as we move forward. And so for us, we never had anything. So naturally, my inclination as I became an adult was to avoid conflict. I naturally yielded a lot because I didn't want to engage. So to me, sometimes it was easier to just throw up my hands and say, you know what, fine, have it your way. And I'll become indifferent and resentful, and our relationship will become destroyed. And I don't necessarily think I always had that thought process in the moment. I obviously see it now in retrospect, the damage that was done by me not using my voice, but I wasn't given the tools. I didn't know how to defend myself, how to create a situation where we could look at conflict as a us versus the problem versus us versus each other. And I just always saw conflict as interpersonal and not about the problem. So that was really the big paradigm shift that I had to make was this isn't about you and me. This is really about a problem that's being put in between us.
Yeah. And I think you saying that we weren't given the skills, right? We kind of go through our lives without explicitly being taught these skills, yet everyone assumes that once we get to be an adult or past our preteen years, when our brains are moving into this adolescent stage where we're figuring ourselves out and the world out, we're just supposed to know these things based on, I don't know, the air we breathe. I don't even know, because we're walking around as examples of the adults who haven't actually learned these skills. We're just learning from each other and just constantly throwing our old baggage at each other about how we deal with conflict. But when we don't do it, quote unquote, the way correctly or the way that feels good for us, we throw judgment at it. And it's not your fault. It's how you were brought up. But if you want to handle it differently, it is your responsibility then to do that work and figure out, okay, well, how do I really want to handle conflict? So what's next? I am a recovering conflict averse person, which is always a journey. Or perhaps you are on that other side of the spectrum. How do you even start to approach this?
So Veterinary Growth Partners, and because of the training that I've had and that Sean has gone through, we have access to assessments. And so, of course, that's a great starting point, because just like with an emotional intelligence assessment, just knowing the you are here sign is really great. You can do it without it. I think a big part of that is reflection and figuring out what you typically lean towards in conflict and whether these are big or small. You mentioned earlier about creating toxicity. Toxicity isn't necessarily formed just by having one big blowout. A lot of times the toxicity forms because of little micro events that add up over time. And maybe it doesn't feel like a big deal the first time you avoid a conflict with one person, but on the 20th, 30th, 40th time you've yielded and that resentment is building and building, then we have that, right? It can equally happen. I mean, we've all had, I'm sure, over the course of our lives, a situation where things just blew up, and that can happen too. But I would just say to try your best to reflect. So I'll kind of go through the high level of what some of those hot buttons and triggers are. For instance, I think knowing what sets you off is really important. However, remembering that you are ultimately responsible for how you respond. So you can communicate to a hot button pusher, as we call them, about how their behavior is triggering for you and how you'd ideally like to see that change through feedback conversations, which we can talk more about. But ultimately, you knowing that you have a trigger of being micromanaged, let's say, does not give you the freedom to say, that's my trigger, so I'm always going to respond aggressively, or I might yell or scream, or I might hide away, kind of that fight, flight, freeze response through conflict of, am I going to fight you about this? Am I going to retreat about this? Am I going to become paralyzed over this? Those are all the natural responses, but you are responsible. So I think that if we go through what some of those are, we have hot buttons around, like I said, micromanaging. We have it around hostility. That is by and far the number one hot button that at least exists in the veterinary industry. My gut says it probably wouldn't be very different with teachers. I just think that, again, when we think about characteristics, traits, attributes of people who are drawn to teaching and people who are drawn to animals, I don't think that it's too far apart. So hostility, and that's just people getting loud, people shouting, throwing, just being big, taking up a lot of space, a lot of emotional space, sucking up all that air in the room, and that can be really frightening. So other hot buttons are abrasiveness, being aloof. I don't know, that was a big trigger for me as I got older, which is funny because I used to be that way. And a lot of times we judge and get frustrated by people who actually behave in a similar way to us because it's something maybe we don't like about ourselves. So it's funny, in thinking about it that way, when I was dealing with somebody who was incredibly aloof, that actually made me become very hostile, which is very unusual for me. Like I said, hostility, micromanaging, overly analytical people can be a hot button. Somebody who just cannot make decisions. They just have to think over and over and over and over again. Self-centered could be a hot button for some people. Being unappreciative, that's another one for me. And I know we always say like millennials always need their like pats on the backs and our trophies of participation.
But you know what, Rachel, that particular one that you just said, underappreciated, is something I hear all the time. When I ask teachers, school leaders, principals, one of the most common things that they say is that I just want to feel respected. I want to feel appreciated. And that is an underlying theme that creates those low level feelings. I think that is pretty universal, at least in this profession.
Oh, 1000%. I know. And I only say that, and I was joking because I think a lot of people are so judgmental of the millennials specifically for being vocal about needing it. And no, I agree. It is unfair of them to judge and also to group everyone in a generation like that, because I know plenty of people who are not millennials who need appreciation, deserve appreciation, and want appreciation. But I find that one interesting because it is a hot button. It is recognized through research that has been done. And it isn't just universal to one age group. And yes, we need to feel appreciated and appreciated in a million ways. A lot of us think about appreciation as like a thank you. No, it could be so much more than that. And even just through appropriate pay, sort of as a baseline. And then on top of all of the other things that we can be appreciative of and just recognizing people's efforts and showing up for them, even just being an active listener to somebody can show your appreciation. Like, I might not be able to help you, but I'm going to hear you and I will do what I can. To me, that's like, that means a lot too. Like, I appreciate how you feel and I appreciate what you need, regardless of what the answer is there. So yeah, unappreciative is definitely a high one for me. My personal number one, it actually might be pretty close with hostility. Hostility really does trigger me, but unreliability is a big one for people.
Yes. Oh, that's a big one for me too. Yes.
Yeah. You say you're going to do something, do it.
Do it. I'm seriously triggered. Like, say what you mean and mean what you say. And I think part of this too, Rachel, is in doing my reflective journey, I have to take a step back and realize that not everyone is me, right? So this is a value of mine, but it might not be a value to everybody else. And I live in a world with lots of people, which is amazing that none of them are me. That's the beauty of how this works. But I think that that value is because I think we talked about this also in episode 1, where when there's some sort of conflict, sometimes it also is a conflict because of a value differentiation.
Big time. Oh, yeah. And that's just it. There's so many other reasons why you could become in conflict with somebody. These are just through the research that was done. And this is actually all through the MTI, the Mediation Training Institute at Eckerd College. And that's where I did the training. And that's the information that we always present to our members. This is essentially through their research, sort of the most common hot buttons that set people off. But like, absolutely, you might be triggered by something else. But I do want to just add in that last one, which is untrustworthiness. That's another big hot button for people. Similar, but different than unreliability. Obviously, somebody breaking your trust. I always say, like, relationships are built on trust, but it's a glass house. Like, one crack and it all falls down. And it is so hard to build trust back. That is something that takes true effort. And you cannot just say, I'm sorry, and expect things to go back to normal. Like, that's a deep one. That's a deep cut. So ultimately with these hot buttons, it's the ability to say, what's triggering me? How does this fit in? If you have a boss, for instance, that every time they leave, you feel like triggered, you feel like there's a conflict of some way, like you just feel like there's always sort of this having a different attitude, perception, thought about a situation that took place, some sort of perception of threat. I'd want that to be the moment where you maybe can reflect and be like, why is my heart beating so fast after I have a meeting with this person always? Is there a conflict? Is there something else going on? Is there something that I'm not saying? Do I feel triggered in any of the ways that I just listed? And how can we address that? Because you can address a hot button pusher. Like I said, you can say, listen, Jen, I get really overwhelmed when you check in on me multiple times a day on the project that I'm working on. I understand that you want to know how things are going and you want to have a say, but I'd really appreciate if we can find a better way so that way I can do my most productive work and we can plan to meet about this at a certain time so I can feel more prepared. I'd also maybe have a conversation with that person about, is there a lack of trust here? right? Do you feel like I'm the right person to do this job? Is there something that I can be showing you or proving to you to have a little bit more space? That's a conflict conversation. And I think some people forget calling it out and having a conversation about how someone's making you feel like there's a conflict. And me just saying something that seems so simple as that, like I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call anyone a name. I didn't point a finger at anybody. I just said, this is what's happening. This is how it's making me feel. And I'd like a better way. It's just that simple.
So simple when you put it that way, right? And I really appreciated what you said too about having that moment of reflection, understanding that, okay, my body's talking to me right now. My heart's beating. I'm sweaty. Or it's beating quickly. Hopefully it's always beating, but it's beating quickly. Or my chest is tight, right? So the work that I do with the folks who are here with me in Empowered Educator know too, that's the first step to everything, because you can't get to that next step of having that conversation with someone if you're still activated. So once you're able to calm your nervous system down to a place where you can really objectively get curious. And I think what was so interesting about that example that you just gave was that after explaining the situation from your perspective, then you started asking questions. And that curiosity creates almost a common ground for the two of you. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, because it goes back to the theory of us against the problem. I could have a problem with you and say, Jen, I am sick and tired of you coming into my office all day long and making me feel like you don't trust me and I just can't take it anymore. I could have said that. But how do we think you're going to respond to that? Your defenses are going to go straight up.
Yeah, my chest is getting tight right now, even in that example.
Yeah. So like my tone was bad. Not that it was bad. It was elevated. You could see that I was feeling big feelings. I'm walking into a conversation with you elevated and escalated and heightened and hot and like ready for a fight. And you can tell. And depending upon how you respond to the conflict, you could be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay. Or you could be like, what are you talking about? So there's just the best that we can do is center ourselves, figure out what's going on, really do the work and understand, again, what is the behavior? We have a really good way of like labeling and doing verbal pointing of the fingers. Like you did this to me and playing victimhood. And my reaction is a product of your behavior. And that is true, but we have to describe it in a way that doesn't put the other person on defense right away. And so curiosity is a great way to get to that. We have a problem, which is that I feel that you don't trust me. I feel like maybe there's an issue about my skill set. Whatever the case may be, I want to figure out why that exists. And that curiosity 100% always is the foundation. Now, when we're having those conversations, the big thing to me is describing the behavior. We say this all the time. We cannot say, you don't trust me, right? The starting that sentence with you is a verbal finger pointing, right? It is assuming something. It is creating this just a blanket statement of how this other person feels, which you don't know for sure. Instead of approaching things that way, we always try to recommend that we change those you statements. So if you're naturally inclined to be like, you don't trust me, like you're mean to me, how do we change that? So the first thing is to say, start the sentence with I feel like when blank, and describe the behavior. So if you feel like that person is mean to you, why? What are the behaviors? I feel like you're mean to me could be, I feel like when you raise your voice, you have a problem with me personally. And that's a lot different than you're so mean to me. When you invite everyone else out after work and you don't extend an invite to me, I feel disrespected. And that feels a lot different than you have favorites. So word choice ultimately becomes a big piece of that. But that's why our words are so important, because we naturally, as the person who'd be receiving the feedback and on the receiving end of this sort of criticism, if somebody were to say you're mean, you probably don't identify as a mean person. So ultimately, you're immediately going to be like, no, I'm not. Because you don't identify that way. You don't see yourself in that way. And you probably don't show up every day planning to be mean to anybody. That's not the goal. So naturally, we want to defend ourselves and say, no, that's not true. That's not me. I don't identify that way. So we have to be really careful to avoid labels like that, because even if in your mind, what you're saying is true, that other person might have sort of an identity break on to say, but I don't have favorites and I'm not mean and I don't micromanage, but they're not hearing what the real problem is.
Right. So in having this conversation, really highlighting the observable, objective behaviors is kind of the key there. And, as you're saying some of these things, one theme actually that's come up a lot this week is passive aggressive. And so every time you're saying the word mean, I'm actually thinking like, passive aggressive is something that keeps coming up too. But again, having a conversation with someone and saying, you're really passive aggressive, that's not going to go well. And no. I don't know if that's something that if you're dealing with someone who you're feeling is they're being passive aggressive to you, that's certainly not how you're going to even want to approach the conversation anyway. So you just don't have a conversation at all.
Definitely. Well, and that kind of brings us into your constructive and destructive responses to conflict. So obviously, in these past examples of me going up to you and having a conversation, that's obviously a very constructive response. It's kind of falls into reaching out, like it's an action. So we have passive responses and we have passive and active responses. And so obviously the active ones are some sort of overt action. Passive is something that happens more internally. And we have active and passive responses in both constructive, so sort of your positive ways of handling conflicts, and your destructive, your negative ways. So just because, for instance, maybe you self-criticize, which again, major one in our industry, that's the number one destructive response to conflict in the veterinary industry. My gut says it's probably the same. I'm curious. I just feel like everyone needs to take an assessment. Every teacher needs to take an assessment. But,
well, I'm going to go do some research about this. Yeah, so I'll get back to you.
But again, it's not just saying that because I do feel like a lot of the same traits, qualities, attributes, characteristics that draw people towards teaching is very, very similar, but different in vet med. We're called towards animals. Obviously, teachers are often drawn towards children and the future and all that sort of stuff. But self-criticizing is a destructive, passive response. And if you've ever participated in that nasty voice in your head telling you how awful you are and how you handled that terribly, and you couldn't believe that you said that, and this person's going to hate you, and how can I show up to work the next day, and replaying it over and over and over and over in your mind until you kind of forget what really happened. And sometimes it really does distort reality. You talk about it nonstop to your family and your friends to a point that it could actually destroy your relationships with those people because it becomes so all-consuming. That's self-criticizing. And you might be like, yeah, well, of course, it's normal to think about something that happened. That would be called reflection. Self-criticizing is like reflection on steroids that is out of control, that you are literally sleeping and dreaming about this conflict and you cannot let it go. That woulda, shoulda, coulda kind of feeling. I lived in here. It's gotten a lot better, but I can't even tell you the amount of sleep I lost over the things I said or didn't say, the things I did or didn't do, the wishes I would have made. I mean, how many of our listeners probably have stood in the shower and been like, I should have said that.
Well, yeah. And it's like that Seinfeld episode, right?
Yeah,
I'm totally dating myself right now, but that's what the shrimp store just called and said they ran out of you or whatever it was, right? But that's what it was. You said it 3 days later. Right. But that's totally a thing. It was the jerk store, not the shrimp store. The shrimp one was another episode with the shrimp. I'm mixing up my Seinfeld episodes.
That's right.
I digress. But yeah, you're right. And this is a scenario that we talk about a lot because there are times when you're up at 3:00 in the morning and you can't shake the thought.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever woken up in the middle of the night thinking about something embarrassing you did in 3rd grade?
Not anymore. But yes, totally.
I have. Yeah, of course. And you're just and you see memes on the internet about it all the time. Oh, can't wait to get some sleep. Brain, are you ready to go to the Wayback Machine and remember that one time in 5th grade? Yeah, it's a big problem. This definitely requires a lot of work, but really it's just to say that some of the most destructive things you can do isn't necessarily screaming and yelling and carrying on. And a lot of times we give all of that stuff a lot more weight. But some of the other passive destructive responses are avoiding, which was, again, a big thing you and I that was our go-to move. Yielding. So basically just essentially saying, whatever you say, I'm not even going to try to give you my opinion, my thoughts, they don't matter. So again, it's also a very it's a defeatist kind of way of going about it. And ultimately, the conflict will resurface because you're not satisfied, and that just won't work for long term. And then, of course, hiding emotions is the other passive. So essentially saying, no, I'm good, everything's fine. But like deep down inside, you want to scream and cry and punch somebody in the face. But you're saying all the right things. And then, of course, what that really does is deteriorates trust, because you've told this person that you're in conflict with that things are fine and they're not. And ultimately, what typically happens is that the conflict continues to build on your side where you feel a certain kind of way. And so, imagine having all these feelings sort of pent up in this big pile inside of you. You tell the person all's fine. So they're just going about their day. They're doing their thing. Maybe this is the micromanager, right? And you're like, oh no, things are good. I love my job. Everything's great. Like, thanks. You're such an attentive boss, talking about passive aggressive, right? So great. So you never tell them how you feel. And then the next time they come into the office, they anger you again. You feel so conflicted. It happens again and again and again and again. And then typically what that will likely lead to is some outburst at some point. The feeling, emotion, and energy about how you feel will come out completely backwards in the wrong place at the wrong time. So yeah, you may lash out at your boss at one point and you may freak out and be like, enough, right? And for you, this was building, but for them, this is a shock. It could happen to your family, to your kids, to your friends, to a driver on the road. It comes out in road rage. It comes out in all sorts of places. A lot of times we self-soothe by eating, drinking, gambling, partying. I mean, you name it. And so this stuff doesn't just disappear. And so that's why, especially these destructive passive ones that just essentially eat you up inside, those can be dangerous, for lack of a better word.
It is dangerous. And as you're talking, I want to actually put a pin in this for next time. Because I think what you're talking about right now is what has been happening to teachers in this profession for years, where we have, and we, royal we, right? We have been saying, it's fine, or complaining about this, but it's okay. I love my job. I do it for the kids. For decades and decades and decades. And it has been building and building and building. And this passive, deconstructive way of dealing with this macro conflict has led to the great resignation of teachers in this profession. And here we are. We've had it. It's done. It's over. And it is imperative that the folks who are here still and the folks who are coming into this profession start to handle conflict differently. Otherwise, we're either going to be modeling this unhealthy behavior or we're not going to make it. And, the most heartbreaking thing of all of this is, obviously the thing that, drives me is that this is affecting our future generations. We're out of time. We are out of time. This needs to be addressed now. So this conflict that we're talking about is, I think, threefold. And this is kind of where I want to put a pin in this. And maybe we can expand on this next time we chat. It's this interpersonal conflict that we need to deal with and manage. It's this interpersonal conflict that we need to deal with. And there's this organizational conflict that we need to maneuver and navigate through. And I think those three tiers is something that, at least for starters, you and I can explore perhaps on our next episode, because I think this is really the foundation of what a lot of our problems stemmed from.
Absolutely. Leave a lot unsaid. We make a lot of assumptions that people know how we feel, and it's just not true. I actually heard this quote from Sean, who I work with, and I just love, and I think about it a lot, especially when I start to self-criticize or spiral. No one thinks about you as much as you think about you. And so if you're thinking that this person must know how I feel, I was so clearly upset, you're wrong. You are 1000% wrong. And maybe there are some people in your life that can read you like a book and who are also willing and able enough to lean into a potentially difficult conversation with you to recognize what's going on and just say like, hey, are you all right? It's written all over you, something's wrong. And that's great. And I hope that there are people in everyone's life that can be that real with you. But don't expect that from your boss necessarily. Don't expect that from your coworker necessarily. Don't think that because this is weighing on you so much, that it's also weighing on that other person so much. And that's why ultimately one of the biggest things that we have to do as a starting point is leaning in to all of it, leaning into how do I feel inside, leaning into what's really the root of the problem here, leaning into the discomfort of actually having a conversation and knowing I'm not necessarily good at this yet. I am wildly uncomfortable. I think I'm going to throw up all over this person, I've been there. Like I've literally gone into a meeting, like with like active sweat dripping down my face, feeling like I was going to be like physically ill and having to just do it anyway. And the reality is you're not going to die. And you have to just lean into that discomfort. And for anyone who's feeling inspired, I would say at this point to be like, okay, I'm going to do a little bit more. Maybe I'm going to do some research. You can hop onto the Mediation Training Institute's website if you want to like do more learning in the meantime. It's a couple of great books that I love, I love Thanks for the Feedback by Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen.
Yes, I always mix up their last names, but that's it. That is a fantastic book. Fantastic.
Yes. And what I love about that is because it's about receiving feedback. So whether you're the one giving it or receiving it, it's great information, because if you're in a position of leadership where you give a lot of feedback, it's just such great perspective about what it's like to receive it.
Well, teachers give feedback all the time.
That's true. Yeah. So that book is great. Difficult Conversations is also great. I actually think Douglas and Sheila are authors on that one. That might also be Crucial Conversations. I always get the two confused, but there's just so much out there. I understand like this is just scratching the surface about what you can do in these conflict conversations. But I would just say that if you're like still feeling ready, like, okay, I'm motivated now, I can't ignore this conflict anymore, I'm going to talk to this person. My biggest piece of advice is just to be authentic and transparent about how having this conversation makes you feel, because I think that that is just a really great connector, because chances are whoever you're talking to is equally nervous and uncomfortable and worried about how this is going to go. So even just saying something like, I'm really grateful that you came here to talk to me, and it's important that we have this conversation. I am so nervous because I've been wanting to have this conversation for so long. It makes me uncomfortable to talk about this. So I hope that you can be patient with me. Like it may take me a little bit to kind of find my words or think about how I feel or whatever. I also think that stating some sort of positive statement of how this is going to go is also really helpful. And I think it sets the tone for the conversation. Something like, I'm really optimistic for how this conversation will end, or I'm really hopeful that we'll find some kind of resolution after this talk. And just saying, it's sort of an open statement that's like, I'm not necessarily coming here to win. I'm just hoping that there's some sort of positive ending to this. And I think that that also creates a lot of comfort in the person that you're going to reach out to say, oh, they're not going to like bite my head off. And, oh, they don't hate me, or, oh, this relationship isn't over, because that could be their beliefs around conflict, is that conflict ends relationships. And so I think that being transparent and saying some sort of statement around your hopefulness for the conversation is a great way to start. And you can continue to circle back to that if you need to, because these things are hard, and even with all the right tools, they're still hard.
They are still hard. But, we can do hard things. And we have all of these tools that are available for us to strengthen our skill set. And when we know better, we do better. That's kind of how this all goes.
Yes, exactly.
So this is going to be another one of those places where we'll stop for now, but there's so much more to talk about, because I really want to dive into what we kind of pinned before, but also having that communication piece, right? Because now that we have this avenue to start having these conversations, tying it into emotional intelligence of relationship management and social awareness, this all really connects together, and we could just talk for days. So we're just going to parse it out into a couple of podcast segments here. So Rachel, this is always so much fun, and I'm just so excited that we get to do this together. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you. This is great. I could talk about this all day. So I love doing it.
Yes. Well, thank you again. And thank you for those of you who are listening. If you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did, go ahead and write a fantastic review. And I can't wait to see you next time on Take Notes. Incredible, right? Together, we can revolutionize the face of education. It's all possible, and it's all here for you right now. Let's keep the conversation going at Empowered Educator Faculty Room on Facebook.